Testing, good. All right, Chav on Zoom, you hear me all right? Excellent. All right. No, not there. All right. All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin our Freilich and Chanukah, everyone. Incredible opportunity. We had the great schus to begin the new parak yesterday, and now Baruch Hashem to continue in that, and especially again, new beginnings. Chanukah is all about new beginnings, all about rededication. So Baruch Hashem, what an incredible schus to be able to begin a new parak, finish one, begin something else. We begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Sammy and Malka Esterson for dedicating all of the Shir and Drashos this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, and Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim. We thank our week of learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in memory of Paul's aunt, Esther Pollack, Esther Bas Zecharia, Zichron Livracha, whose yahrzeit is on the 29th of Kislev. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors in the schus of Refuah Shlema for Ruchama Aviva Bas Shein Lechana, as well as for Achal Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel. And we thank Alan Wiseman for dedicating the daf to the memory of his mother, Devora Miriam Bas Moshe HaKohen. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And we have an anonymous sponsorship today in honor of Menachem Schoenfeld's birthday. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. This is the mamish the quote. May his passion for Torah, community service, chesed, and spiritual growth, and really, really nice wine continue in health until 120. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, Menachem. Amei ve'esrim shanim tovos. I would say, just as an aside, Daf Yomi sponsorships are incredible birthday gifts, anniversary gifts, whatever, for all occasions it works. Also with that, let us begin. So today's Daf is Chaf Beis 22. We are picking up on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis 21b, 7 lines up from the bottom. So also, if you remember again yesterday, we really introduced to an incredibly dramatic idea, which was this concept of from where do we know the Isser Hana'ah of Chametz. So also, remember again, we learned. Where do we learn the Isser Hana'ah from? But the pasuk. Which pasuk? Right. Lo ye'achal. Remember again, the wording is very important over here. Lo ye'achal means what? How does the Gemara understand? How does the Gemara teach lo ye'achal? It should not come to be eaten. Rabbi said this is you have to understand that you have to be holding up in this concept because everything is based on this. Remember, the pasuk could have just said lo yochal, could have just said don't eat it, but it says lo ye'achel. The food, the chametz, should not come to be eaten. What does it mean the chametz should not come to be eaten? So the Gemara understands from that what it means is you should not really handle the food. You shouldn't get any benefit from the food because often, if we allow you to get benefit from the food, you may come to consume the food. So the Gemara says, this is very interesting, but remember, this was a statement of Chizkiah. The Gemara just points out, by the way, just want to point out that there's another statement of Rabbi Avo. Rabbi Avo holds that normally, halacha lamaisa, any time you find the lashon of lo yochal, lo yochel, lo sochal, lo sochlu, Rabbi Avo says that always includes an Isser Hana. Right? Or Rabbi Avo Shita is anytime the Torah pretty much conveys an Isser Achila, it always automatically includes an Isser Hana, unless, of course, what? It tells you that it doesn't. Right? But I will say, but again, it has to explicitly tell you like it doesn't. The paradigmatic example of that is Nevela. Right? Where Nevela, the Torah tells us don't eat Nevela, you can go ahead and give it to the ger, you can give it to the guy, you give it to the nachri. But again, unless, of course, the pasuk tells you that halacha lemaisa, you can get hana, we automatically assume that any Isra Achila always includes an Isra Hana. So we'll say now we're going to go, today's daf is going to be focused on this idea about concepts of Isuri Achila. Do they include Isra Hana, not include Isra Hana? We'll loop back to Chametz Emir Tashem tomorrow. So the Gemara says as follows, Bishlama, Rabbi Meir da Amar Echad Ger ve'Echad Nachri be'Mechir be'Mnesina. So we'll say, remember again, also, in yesterday's daf, we had a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Ultimately, again, remember the Torah by Nevela phrases it as follows, that what can you do with the Nevela? You can give it to the ger, which we identified as a ger toshav, or you could sell it to the nachri. Rabbi Meir says that's not exact. You could give it to whoever you want, you could sell it to whoever you want. Torah is just telling us that halacha l'maisa, the preference is give it to the ger, because you have a chiyuv to go ahead and sustain the ger, which you do not have by the nachri. Rabbi Huda understands dvarim kichsavan. Rabbi Huda understands that no, the Torah is coming to give you a specific direction. You can give it to the ger, or you can go ahead and sell it to the nachri. But you cannot go. But those are the options on the table. So the Gemara says, Bishlan Rameir Damar Echad Ger V'Echad Nachri Ben Mechiv Nesina. It's according to Rameir, who says that you can give it to a ger or you can sell it to a nachri. There's no hakpada. There's no real insistence one way or the other. The fact that the Torah needs to go out of its way to tell me that an avela is mutar ba'ana tells me what? Hakol Yisurin Shabbatorah asurin bein ba'achila bein ba'ana. So we'll say, so according to Rabbi Meir, the fact that the Torah has to go out of its way to tell me that nevela is mutar ba'ana tells me that in general, all other isurei achila are asar ba'ana. El Rabbi Yehuda Damar L'Dran Kich Savan Huda Asa. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, says that the pasuk ultimately again is coming to give me a very specific halacha. You could give the nevela to a ger or you could sell it to a nachri. Ha kol isurin shevatora minalan di isurin ba'ana. So I'll say, where does he learn out that in general again isuri achila are also asar ba'ana? Nafgalei milakelev tashlichun also. The say he will learn it from the pasuk. You should throw it to the dogs. Now, remember again, this is talking about a treifa. Treifa is an animal. At least in this context, the treifa is an animal that's killed by another predatory animal. So now you have the carcass. What can you do with the carcass? So the pasuk says, "La kelev tashlichuno." So throw it to the dogs. Throw it to the dogs. So once I top off Chav Beis, if we have time, I'm going to go ahead and tell you a beautiful vart on that pasuk. If you have a little bit more time, so the Gemara says, "La kelev tashlichuno." So you could go ahead and. I'm sorry. Like you could throw the throw the treifa to the dogs. I'm just distracted. I see Jerry's on his way somewhere in Eretz Yisrael, and I'm just on the kind of wherever he's going. I'd like to know. So Jerry, maybe you'll just WhatsApp me where exactly where you're headed to. There's a big smile, and he's on a bus in Eretz Yisrael. I'm the kana. Okay, so we'll say it's the top of Chav Beis. Sorry, got a little distracted there. So the Gemara says as follows: So you go ahead and you throw the treifa to the dog, so the top of Chav Beis, Osa atamashlich lekelev. Sa'alocha l'maisa, again, that item, the treifa, you can go ahead and throw to the dog. Via tamashlich lekelev kol isurin shebatorah. But I will say, interestingly enough, that's only by treifa. Other isurin you cannot. So I will say, so again, Rabbi Huda will say, the fact that the Torah by treifa tells you that if your animal is torn apart by a predatory animal, you could go ahead and throw that carcass to your dog. The Torah is telling you by treifa you could get hana, but in any other isser achila, any other time the Torah goes out and says you're not allowed to eat something, halacha l'maisa, that automatically includes an isser hana. The Gemara says, Rabbi Meir, osa tamashlich lekelev, via tamashlich lekelev chulin shenishchetu ba'azara. So we'll say Rabbi Meir comes along and says, no, that pasuk actually teaches me something different. It teaches me I can throw a treifa, I can give a treifa to my dog, but I cannot throw to my dog chulin shenishchetu ba'azara, which Rabbi Meir means a non-sacrificial animal which you accidentally went ahead and shechted inside of the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Meir says you can't, that carcass pretty much becomes unusable. You can't throw that to your dog. V'idach, Rabbi Yehuda will say, Chulin shnishchetu ba'azar lav doraisi. So Rabbi Yehuda will say, no. But Chulin shnishchetu ba'azar, will say that is not a biblical prohibition. That's not an isur doraisa, and therefore halacha l'maisa, again, I don't need a pasuk to exclude that. So therefore, I will say again, so I just keep track of the cases, because remember again, we're going to have to go back at some point in time and resolve each of these cases independently. So far, I will say follow the progression. We have Chizkiah saying, I learn out the Isser Hana by Chametz from Lo Yeachel. The Gemara challenges that because Rabbi Avo says you don't need to make a special drasha, because pretty much any time the Torah goes in and says you can't eat something, eating or prohibition of eating always includes Hana, except when it doesn't. Where doesn't it? Well, case number one is by nevela. That opened the door to the nevela case. So we'll say now by nevela, everyone agrees that the nevela is mutar ba'ana. There's a sub-machlokes in Rabbi Yehuda about the proper way to get hana from the nevela. Giving it to a ger, selling it to a nachri. Can you go ahead and sell to whoever you want, give to whoever you want? Is there a precedence by who you sell to, who you give it to? Fine, that's a sub-machlokes. So we'll say, but the Gemara explains that still what comes out from there is this concept that, at least according to Rabbi Meir, that Allah Chalamayse, any time the Torah will say in Isra Achila also includes in Isra Na. That was according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda, where does he learn out that concept from? He learns out the concept like Kelev Tashlichuno. So the fact that by Treifa, The Torah has to tell me that I could throw this treifa to my dog. Tells you that under normal circumstances, when something is prohibited for consumption, what's the halacha? It's also asur ba'ana. Okay, so we'll say, so everybody's kind of agreeing to the same basic principle, but halacha is learning it out from different places. Master Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, v'hari gid anosha. What about gid anosha? Right? The prohibition to consume the sciatic nerve. The Rachmana Amar, Al Kain, Lo Yochlu B'nei Yisrael Gid Anosha. So we'll say, now watch this. Torah tells us we're not allowed to eat Gid Anosha. We'll say, it's an interesting din. Gid Anosha is one of the interesting halachas because in general, the Yerushalmi brings down the concept of Ein L'meidin Davar Mikodem Matan Torah. We don't learn out binding halacha anything that happened before Matan Torah, before Har Sinai, which is why, for example, we'll say the halacha is that where do we learn out Bris Milah from? We learn out Bris Milah ultimately, again, from Parshas Tazria. Why don't learn out from Avram Avinu? Because so it's interesting because there are a couple of exceptions to this rule. One of the exceptions is Gid Hanosha, right? Because interestingly enough, the prohibition of Gid Hanosha is brought down in Parshas Vayishlach. And that's, again, so just something to keep in mind. So what about Gid Hanosha? So the Torah says you can't eat Gid Hanosha. Now, based on what we just learned, if the Torah says you can't eat it, what else does that include? Hana. But watch this. This is great. The Gemara says, Utnan, Sholeach Adam Yarach Lenachri, Vigit Hanasha Besocho. Yet you can go ahead and send a piece of meat with the Git Hanasha inside of it to a non-Jew. What's the piece of meat with the, what is it? Filet mignon. Good. You could go ahead and send your piece of filet mignon to the Nachri with the Gid still in it. With the Gid, because also obviously the Nachri could eat the Gid. Listen to this. Because again, Abba say everybody could see the Gid embedded in. Abba say now, again, Rashi points out, what's the concern over here? Watch this. If Ruvain sees me sending a filet mignon to my Nachri neighbor, so Ruvain is going to assume that whatever comes from my home is kosher. So therefore, again, he might go over to the Nachri and purchase the piece of meat from the Nachri. The Gemara says, we're not concerned about that. Why not? Since halacha lemaisa, mekomo nikar, everyone knows what a gid hanosha looks like. Even if Reuven would go and purchase that from the Nachri, he would see that it hasn't been trebered. Right? He can see that the gid hanosha is still there, and we're not concerned that he's going to come to inadvertently consume the gid hanosha. I will say, but what do you see from here? The fact that I could send a piece of meat with the gid hanosha inside of it tells me what? That halacha lemaisa I can get hana from a gid. So what's going on over here? Torah says you can't eat the gid hanosha. You just told me in general, whenever there's an isra achila automatically includes isra hana. But yet halacha lemaisa again, that's clearly not the case over here. To which the Gemara says, watch this. Kasav Rabbi Avo, what Rabbi Avo would say, and remember again, Rabbi Avo was the one who said in general, when he's the one who espoused the principle. Anytime the Torah says, lo yocha, lo sochlu, lo yochlu, lo sochlu, means isra hana. Even Rabbi Avo will agree that this case is an exception. Why? Get ready for this. He said very simply, Kisha Torah, the Gemara says, Kasav Rabbi Avo, Kisha hutra nevela, he vechel bavegida hutra. To which Rabbi Avo says, because halacha lemaisa, when the Torah went ahead and permitted nevela, like we saw in the previous pasuk, the Torah also goes ahead and halacha lemaisa permits its chelev, its gid. So I'll say, so now this is very interesting. So the Gemara says, we'll say, so now, so what's your obvious kasha? Okay, what's your not so obvious kasha? So that statement works very well with a non-kosher animal. But I will say that's not our case. Right? Our case is where I'm sending the Nachri a piece of meat from a kosher. Remember again, what did the Gemara just say? Rabbi Avo said, pretty much once nevela is mutter ba'ana, as we just learned before, it's pretty much every part of the nevela, right? It's the chelav of the nevela, it's the gid of the nevela. So we'll say, but again, this is not a nevela case. This is a kosher case. So look at Rashi, first white line in Rashi. He v'chalba v'gida hutra leficha kol chelav v'kol gid mutar ba'ana sheim bichlal leger asher b'sharechet titan leva'achla shegam henkruim ima nevela v'lecha heter hana belav gid lo shna nevela v'lo shna kshera. So we'll say this is a dramatic limud. Rabbi Avo will say like this. Essentially, once nevela becomes permitted, bana, as we saw before, right? That's a pasuk. Pasuk says you can give it to the ger, sell it to the nachri. So nevela is permitted bana. Once nevela becomes permitted bana, we'll say what part of nevela is permitted bana? What part? All of it, including the gid. And Rabbi Avo is saying, well, once gid is mutter ba'ana by nevela, it's also going to be mutter ba'ana where? By kosher animal as well. In other words, once gid hanosha is mutter ba'ana, you're not going to start being mechalik between the gid of an avela is mutter ba'ana, but the gid of a kosher animal is not mutter ba'ana. No, once you've established that gid is mutter ba'ana by an avela, lo shna nevela, lo shna kshira, gid hanosha is mutter ba'ana. Therefore, I can go ahead and send the filet mignon to my non-Jewish neighbor, and thereby getting hana from the gid. Pretty dramatic and incredible halacha. So the Gemara says, this is so exciting because there's a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of halachas and gemaras that are all, what's the word? Not coinciding, but coinciding. Because the Gemara says as follows. So we'll say this makes sense. This makes sense according to the opinion that says that the gid hanosha contributes to the flavor of the nevela. Or is that essentially that a gid has no same tam, that a gid has tam, a gid has flavor like a nevela. Therefore, again, once the nevela is permitted, then ultimately, again, every part of the nevela is permitted. In other words, we'll say that the gid, say a little differently, when we say yesh begidim no same tam, that means that the gid has the status of basar, of meat. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, just like the meat of the nevela is mutter, so the gid is going to be mutter as well. However, but according to the opinion who holds that a gid does not have tam basar, and therefore I will say again, now what's the status of a gid if it doesn't have tam basar? Then again, it would simply be eitz ba'alma, right? It would be nothing. It would be nothing. I will say, now here's the problem. The problem is, if it doesn't have tam and it's not basar, then it should not be included under the license of permission of nevela. Right? Remember again, the only way to say that halacha l'maisa that gid is included under the permit of hana by nevela is to say that it has the din of basar nevela. That works well if you hold that gid has the tam basar. But halacha l'maisa, if you don't hold that gid hanosha has the din of basar, then why should it be permitted behana under the umbrella of nevela? To which the Gemara says, "Man shamis le'da'amar le'im begidim b'no same time." Who is the opinion who holds that a gid? We'll say no. Just so you understand, that lashon of no same time is a chulin lashon, right? That no same time means that if it were to be put in a mixture, does it emit flavor? But for our purposes, we're going to understand no same time means that it has the identity of basar. So who is the opinion who holds that gid doesn't have the din of basar? Rabbi Shimon. It's Rabbi Shimon Disanya. Listen to this. If a person eats the gid hanasha of a non-kosher animal, so we'll say, watch this. Now remember, when we say non-kosher, that could be literally a non-kosher species or an animal which didn't have shchita, nevela, treifa. So this is fascinating. What happens if you eat the gid of a non-kosher animal? What's the halacha? Rabbi Yehuda mechayev shtayim. This is wild. Rabbi Yehuda says you violate two isurim. What are the two isurim? Number one, you're eating non-kosher meat. Number two, you're eating gid hanasha. So two isurim. Rabbi Shimon poter. This is incredible. Rabbi Shimon actually says that halacha l'maisa, you're pater. You're pater. We'll say, now why are you pater? He holds ein begid b'nosin tam because a gid doesn't have tam basar, and because ultimately again it doesn't. So look at Rashi actually. Rabbi Shimon poter legamrei b'behema tamei pater tekasavra ein begid b'nosin tam basar. Umigid nami pater dechi asari rachmana agid heicha debisara mutter. So we'll say Rabbi Shimon has a very interesting shita. Rabbi Shimon holds the only time gid hanasha is asar is the gid hanasha of a kosher animal. But the gid hanasha of a non-kosher animal is not prohibited. So therefore Rabbi Shimon will say if you eat the gid of a non-kosher animal, you're actually totally pater. You're pater because it doesn't have the status of the vela or treif or whatever, or of a treif animal. And also, you're not chayiv because the prohibition of gid hanasha only applies to the gid of a kosher animal. Rashi says over here, well, you could look at Rashi says, Rashi and Rabbi Shimon Poter goes through all of this. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon ha'chinami d'asr ba'ana. Rabbi Shimon would also hold that it's asr ba'ana. Where do we see that? This sanya. Gid hanasha mutter ba'ana. Divrei Rabbi Huda. Ultimately, again, Rabbi Huda says that it's mutter ba'ana. Rabbi Shimon oseh. Rabbi Shimon says that halacha l'maisa, it is going to be asr ba'ana. So we'll say, interestingly enough, as much as, so there's a machlokes that machlokes by gid hanasha, is gid hanasha mutter ba'ana or aser ba'ana. So I'll say, so again, one school of thought says Gid Hanosha is mutter ba'ana. But why is Gid Hanosha mutter ba'ana? Essentially, it's not a separate din by Gid Hanosha. It's a derivative of what? Of what? Of nevela. Of nevela. Gid, once nevela was permitted, every part of the nevela is permitted, including the Gid Hanosha. And once the Gid Hanosha of a nevela is permitted, so ultimately, again, the Gid Hanosha of a kosher animal is also permitted ba'ana. But you do have the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon holds that no, Gid Hanosha, in fact, will be aser ba'ana. So both say, so therefore, again, Gid Hanosha case, subject to machlokes. We'll see what the halacha l'mais is. V'hari dam, what about blood? What about blood? Dirachmana amar kol nefesh mikem lo sochal dam. The Torah says you can't eat blood. So both say, so again, remember, we have one singular focus over here. Rabbi Avo came along and told us that whenever the Torah says, lo yochal, lo sochel, lo yochlu, it's always an isser hana. So therefore, when I see a pasuk that says, kol nefesh mikem lo sochal dam, my reflexive reaction is, what does it include? What does it include? Isser hana. So the Gemara says, well, 1 second. We'll say, this is incredible. Utanan, but we learned. This is really incredible. Utanan, elu v'elu misarvin ba'amo, v'yotzin l'nachal kidron, v'nim korin liganonin l'zevel. So the Gemara, listen to this, we'll say. This is really incredible. Look at Rashi, elu v'elu. Shiyare, it's about 7 lines from the bottom of Rashi. Elu v'elu. Shiyare dam chatos ha'penimios, hanishbachin al yisod ma'arev shom zeach ha'chitzon. V'shiyare dam chatos ha'chitzonos, hanishbachin al yisod romi. Yotzin min ha'yisod l'ritzba, derech shnei nekavim kitanim. So we'll say, listen to this. Remember, zrika, sprinkling of the blood of the mizbech, is the pivotal avoda of sacrificial avoda. But there was always leftover blood. What did you do with leftover blood? There was a drainage system by the different corners of the Beis Hamikdash. So different remnants of blood were poured out by different corners. We'll say, now that drainage system took the blood out ultimately to the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley. So we'll say, so now this is incredible. The Gemara says, what would happen? The blood would flow out to the Kidron Valley. Listen to these words. So the Gemara says, and what happens? Korin. And the Gizbar, the temple treasurer, would sell the blood to the local farmers to be used as fertilizer. But if you use it without purchasing it from the Beis HaMikdash, because also remember again, the act of purchasing does what? It deconsecrates the blood, right? It shifts the sanctity of the blood from the blood to the money. But if you use the blood without purchasing it, ultimately again, mo'ol and bo, then unfortunately you've committed an act of mi'ilah. So we'll say, so what do you see from here? Blood is mutter ba'ana, even though halal. So again, you have to take care of the mi'ilah issue, but lamaisa, blood is not aser ba'ana, blood is mutter ba'ana. So what's going on over here? The Gemara says, shani dam de'iskish l'mayim. Blood is different, because blood is compared to what Abba says, you've seen a number of times. Dechsev lo sachlanu ala aretz tishbachenu kamayim. Mamayim mutarim, af dam mutter. Because Abba says, the pasuk says when it comes to blood, even though you're not allowed to eat it, what do you do with it? Pour it out on the ground like water. And the Gemara says, just like water is mutter ba'ana, so to dam, so to blood is mutter ba'ana. Ve'ema kamayim hamiskantzim agami ozech. What was saying, but maybe it means like water that's poured on the altar, right? By nisa chamayim, which again is sacrificial water, right? Which is prohibited for anal. Rov mayim. No, when the Torah says that blood should be like water, it means like what kind of water? The majority of waters. And the majority of waters, I will say, not used for the mizbeach, they're poured out on the ground. Rov mayim ksiv, does the pasuk say majority waters? Ella amrav ashi, kemayim hanishpachim, velo kemayim hanisachim. The Torah is saying that blood is like water, which is spilled out, and not like water which is used as a libation. But why don't you say it's like water that's spilled out before idolatry? In other words, we'll say there was water used in idolatrous service as well. And just like water used in idolatrous service is going to be asr ba'ana. So we halakha l'may say again, this water should be this dam should be asr ba'ana as well. Hasam nami nisuch ikri. We'll say water poured out before avodah zarah is not called mayim nishpachin. It's also called mayim nisachin. It's also called the libation d'chsev yishtu yayin nisicha. So therefore, remember, even though blood has an isser achila, and according to Rabbi Avo, anytime there's an isser achila, it also translates into an isser hana. Blood has an additional phrase. Alo ares tishbachenu kamayim. And the Gemara's understanding over here, the Torah is equating blood with water. And just like water could be spilled, just like water is spilled out on the ground and ultimately again permitted by hana, so too blood is also poured out on the ground and is mutter ba'ana, as evidenced by the fact that they sold the remnant sacrificial blood to the farmers as fertilizer. Amud Beis, u'lechizkiya l'may hilchosa iskish dam l'mayim. So it's according to Chizkiya. Now remember again, I will say Chizkiya, right? Chizkiya also said. Remember, Chizkiya was one who introduced us to this idea that halacha l'maisa. From where do we know that there's an Isser Chametz on Pesach? From the phrase of lo ye'achel chametz, right? So again, Chizkiya in principle will agree that wherever there's an Isser Achila also goes ahead and includes Isser Hana. So the Chizkiya lemay hilchasa iskish dam. I'm sorry, excuse me, just the opposite. Chizkiya Rabosai holds that in general, lo yochal just means an Isser Achila. Just means Isser Achila, right? Remember again, chametz is different. Why? Because what does the Torah say by chametz? Lo ye'achel. There's a different form of the word. But in general, Chizkiya will say when the Torah says lo yochal, lo sochal, that just means Isser Achila. So therefore, I will say this is very important because according to Chizkiya, when the Torah says kol nefesh mikem lo sochal dam, Chizkiya will say, what does that teach you? What does that teach you? Isser Achila. You can't eat blood. So therefore, I will say. So here's what's interesting. If I just interpret that as meaning I just don't eat blood, it's just an Isser Achila and Isser Hana. So why do I need the comparison to water? Remember, you know, the comparison to water works very well according to Rabbi Avo and company, who hold that whenever there's an Isser Achila automatically includes Isser Hana. Therefore, the Torah comes along and says, Ala ares tishbachenu kamayim, to equate blood to water, to tell me just as water is not Asr ba'ana, so too blood is not Asr ba'ana. But according to Chizkiya, who holds, Stam Isser Achila, lo yochal, just means you can't eat it. It never means Hana, right? And the only reason by Pesach that an Isser Achila means Hana is because the way the Isser Achila is written, it doesn't say lo yochal chametz, it says lo ye'achel chametz. Do not allow chametz to be eaten or to come to be eaten, which includes an Isser Hana. But according to Chizkiya, why does the Torah have to compare blood to water? Why do you need that phrase? Ala aris tishbachenu kamayim l'Chizkiya l'may hilchasa iskish dam l'mayim. Here we go. L'chid Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amram Yochanan. Minayim l'dam kodshim sheno machshav. I'll say this goes back to the last parak. From where do we know about saying that sacrificial blood is not machshav? Remember again, as we saw in Rabbi Chanina's Kana Kohanim, the concept that an item could only be makabel tuma, could only receive tuma, is only receptive tuma if what? If it comes in contact with one of the zayin mashkin, one of the 7 liquids, and amongst those 7 liquids is blood. But how do I know that sacrificial blood is not machshir? That sacrificial blood does not make something roy lekabel tuma, to which the Gemara says, "Shenemar lo sochlenu ala aretz tishbachenu kamayim." The pasuk says, when it comes to blood, don't eat it, spill it out on the ground like water, which teaches us Tam shenishbach kamayim machshir, shenishbach kamayim enu machshir. Teaches us as what Rabbi was saying. See, remember, how do I know that blood is one of the 7 liquids that can make something ra'ui lekabel tuma, receptive to tuma? Because the Torah compares blood to water. And from there we learn that what? It is only blood that is like water that has the ability to be machshir something lekabel tuma. What's the type of blood, therefore, that's like water? The type of blood that could be spilled out on the ground, which comes to exclude what? Sacrificial blood, which cannot just be spilled out on the ground, but rather, again, either has to be applied to the mizbeach or has to first be redeemed. Good. Say everyone say good. So let's go weiter. What about Ever Menachai? Ever Menachai, remember again, is a limb torn from a living animal. Where the Torah says, Dichsiv lo sochal hanefeshim abasar. So the Torah says you can't eat the flesh or I should say you can't eat the nefesh of the basar, the life of the animal or the limb of the animal when the life is still in it. So we'll say again, being phrased as an Isser Achila. According to Rabbi Avo and company, whenever you see an Isser Achila, what does that also include? Isser Hana. But what about the following? V'tanya, we learned Rabbi Nassan, Omer Minayin Shlo Yoshit Adam Kos Yain L'Nazir Ve'ever Menachal Ibn Noach. Well, it is incredible. How do you know that you should not offer a Nazir a glass of wine? And you shouldn't offer a Nazir a glass of wine. Or that you shouldn't offer a nice, tantalizing piece of Ever Menachai to a Ben Noach. Because remember again, Ever Menachai is one of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. So how do you know that you can't go ahead and offer up? So say it doesn't say to a Jew. Why doesn't it say to a Jew? Jew also says it's Sheva Menachai. Why does it say to a Jew? a Jew can't eat it anyway because the animal is not kosher, right? If you take Eiver min Achai, that means the animal wasn't slaughtered. So again, remember, a guy, right, a Nachri doesn't have a din of Shchita. Maybe he doesn't mean he is not bound by the dietary laws, by the halachos of Shchita. So halacha l'maisa is, how do you know that you shouldn't extend a cup of wine to another or an Eiver min Achai to a guy, to a B'nai Noach? Tamalomar, v'lifnei Iver lo sitei mechshol. Because the pasuk says you should not place a stumbling block in front of a blind person. So we'll say extending a cup of wine to a nazir, extending a piece of Eiver min Achai to a nachri is if neiver is placing a stumbling block. But what can you infer from this? Haliklovim shari. So we'll say what you could see from here is what? To go ahead and throw a piece of Eiver min Achai to the dogs would be permitted. So we'll say, what do you see from here? The Eiver min Achai is what? Is mutter ba'ana. But one second, the Torah phrases it as an Isser Achila, right? The Torah said, Lo sochal nefesh im abasar. Rabbi Avo, if you're correct, every Isser Achila, by definition, includes an Isser Hana. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Shiny Eiver min Achai de iskish ladam. Eiver min Achai is different. Why? Because Eiver min Achai is compared to blood. It's compared to blood. Where is it compared to blood? Dechsiv rak chazak levelti echol hadam. Ki adam hu hanefesh. Rabbi say, see, interestingly enough, when we say it's compared, ultimately, again, the psukim themselves are juxtaposed. Right? He says, "Rak is not just it's the same pasuk. Rak chazak liveltia chol adam ki adam hu hanefesh v'lo sochal hanefesh im habasar." It's the same pasuk. So the Torah first says, "Don't eat blood," and then says, "Don't eat Eiver min Achai." What does the comparison teach us, Rabbi say? The comparison teaches us that what? That halacha l'maisa, just as blood is mutter ba'ana, so to what? Eiver min Achai is mutter ba'ana as well. So meaning it's not a refutation. Rabbi Avo's principle could still stand, that whenever the Torah puts forward an Isser Achila, normally Isser Achila also includes what? Isser Hana. But it happens to be like any rule, like any rule, you have exceptions. So, for example, even though Eiver min Achai is mentioned or is written as an Isser Achila, because it is compared to dam, and we just established that dam is mutter ba'ana, so too again, Eiver min Achai will be mutter ba'ana. U'lechizkiya lemay hilchasa iskish Eiver min Achai ledam. And remember again, Chizkiya doesn't have any of these problems. Why not? Because according to Chizkiya, when the Torah says an Isser Achila includes what? Includes what? Achila and only Achila, not Hana. So therefore, I both say, again, the fact that Eiver min Achai is mutter ba'ana, totally fine. Just like the same way that dam is mutter ba'ana, totally fine. The only reason, again, why Chizkiya holds that chametz is aser ba'ana is because the Torah writes the Isser Achila in a more kind of, or more protracted or elongated fashion. That's all. So according to Chizkiya, why do I need the comparison between Eiver min Achai and dam? It's not to permit Eiver min Achai ba'ana. Because remember, again, I don't need a limud to permit Eiver min Achai ba'ana. Why not? Because the Torah only prohibits achila. And if it only prohibits achila, that just means achila. I don't know. So what does the comparison teach me? Watch this. So the Gemara says, "L'chizkiya l'may hilchasa iskish Eiver min Achai l'dam, amar l'cha dam hu de iskish Eiver min Achai." So Chizkiya says, no, you got the comparison wrong. It's not Eiver min Achai that's compared to dam, but rather, again, it's dam which is compared to Eiver min Achai. Meaning what? Ma Eiver min Achai aser, af dam min hachai aser. Oh, to teach me as follows, that just as a limb from a living animal is aser, so too blood from a living animal is also aser. Ba'achilo. Ve'ezazeh, and when we say blood from a living animal, what does that mean? Dam hakaza shanefesh yotzabo. It is the blood, Rabbi say, by bloodletting, in which the life of the animal would leave it. So Rabbi say, Rashi points out over here that apparently in the world of bloodletting, there's dalid mine dam. There's 4 different types of blood. So this is the blood with which essentially the life force would leave the animal. So halacha l'maisa, just like the Eiver min Achai, the limb of a living animal is aser ba'achila, so too ultimately again the lifeblood of the animal which exits the animal is also aser ba'achila. Okay, so when it goes weiter, Shar Niskel, listen to this case. What about Shar Niskel? Suppose remember again, what's the case of Shar Niskel? Shar Niskel is an ox which killed a person, and therefore as a result, the ox is going to be stoned. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Drachmana Amar lo yochal, lo yochas b'saro. The pasuk says, you should not go ahead I'm sorry, lo ye'achel es bisaro. You should not go ahead and eat the flesh of the animal. Then Abba say, now let's analyze this for just a moment. Now remember again, how are you killing this shar? How are you killing the shar? You're stoning it. So let's understand. It's Vitanya, we learned. The fact that the Torah says you have to stone the ox, so we'll say, if you stone the ox, then what? The ox becomes an avela. If it's an avela, unavela surah ba'achila. So we'll say, why do you have to tell me I can't eat a shar haniskal? Of course I can't eat a shar haniskal. Right? They will say shar haniskal is an avela. It's an animal that died by stoning. Right? I can only eat an animal that's killed with shchita. So why does it have to tell me that I can't eat a shar haniskal? It's great kasha. Watch this. Get ready. Magid l'cha kasav shimshachto la'achar shenigmar as dino aser. Ooh, very interesting. We'll say. So what happens if Beis Din paskin on the shar? Right, Beis Din said the shar is going to be put to death, and what happens? I chop it right after the Gemara din, and I shecht it. So here I have an animal that had a proper shechita, died a proper shechita. The Torah says lo yachel. The Torah says you can't eat it. Once the Gemara din, once the verdict has been passed on this animal, even with shechita, it does not become permitted for consumption. Amy alachila. So we'll say. So first of all, again, I only know that it's prohibited for consumption. Ba'na minayin. From where do I know that it is prohibited bahana as well? To which the Gemara says, listen to this, Talmud Lomar ubal hashar naki. The pasuk says that literally the owner of the shar will be cleansed. My mashma. So we'll say, I don't understand. Now we'll say, now bipashtos bal hashar naki means what? That Allah lamaisa, the owner has no culpability. Once the ox is killed, bal hashar naki, the owner is freed from any liability. So the Gemara is suggesting Bala Sharnaki teaches me that is an Isra Na. My mashma, how do I know that Bala Sharnaki means Isra Na? Shimon ben Zoma Omer, Ka'adam She'omer Lechavero, Yatsa Ploni B'nechasav, Ve'ein Lo Bahem Hana'a Shal Klum. So we'll say apparently it was a common phrase when someone lost their money or someone lost their property, the lashon that would be used was Yatsa Ploni Naki Minechasav. So and so has been cleansed from his assets. Right, so apparently, again, an asset cleansing is when you lose your money. So therefore, I will say the Gemara suggests over here, Bala Sharnaki also means. See, therefore, it's two parts of the pasuk. When the Torah says lo yachel, you can't eat it. That refers to even if you shechted the ox before it was stoned, right? You shechted it after the Gemar din, you're still not allowed to go ahead and eat it to asher b'achila. But there's also an isser hana. Learn that from Bala Sharnaki, to which the Gemara says, Taima de Kasa Bala Sharnaki. Then I will say, interesting enough, the only reason there's an Isra Hana by Shar Niskal is why? Because the Torah brought down this phrase, of Bala Sharnaki. Dimi lo yop, lo ye'achel, Isra achila mashma, Isra Hana lo mashma. I will say, but again, this is a Kasher Rabbi Avo. Because according to Rabbi Avo, I will say, again, remember, it's really, we have one topic today. According to Rabbi Avo, I will say, anytime the Torah puts down an Isra achila, what does it automatically include? Isra Hana as well. If that's the case, then by Shar HaNiskal, once the Torah says Lo Ye'achel, according to Rabbi Avo, that should also include what? An Isra Hana. So why do I need an extra phrase of Ubal Hashar Naki to teach me that there's an Isra Hana? The Isra Hana should be derived from the Isra Achila. To which the Gemara says, the Olam Lo Ye'achel Isra Achila ve'Isra Hana mashma. To which the Gemara says, you're right. In Rabbi Avo's view, the phrase Lo Ye'achel includes both an Isra Hana and an Isra Achila. Now watch this. So we'll say, so if that's the case, why do I need Ubala Shar Naki? Listen to this. Ubala Shar Naki, Lahanas Orahu Da'asa. We'll say this is very interesting. Bala Shar Naki means that even after the animal is stoned, and even after the animal is killed, the owner cannot get benefit from the hide. Interesting. So as Rabbi say, so Lo Ye'achel will cover the Isra Hana, both of the meat, or I'm sorry, Lo Yachel will cover both the Isra Achila and the Isra Hana. But that's really the Isra Hana ultimately of what? Of the basar. Bala Sharnaki comes along to teaching that halacha l'maisa, the owner can't get benefit from the hide as well. The hide itself is asar b'hana. To which the Gemara is who does the itzrich, because we'll say this is required. Why? Because I would have thought Lo Yachel es b'saroksiv. Remember again, the Torah phrases the Isra Achila ultimately again by basar. By basar. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, Bisaro in orolo. Ultimately, again, I will say the prohibition ultimately is with what? Is with the basar, but not with, so I'll say, remember again, the Isra Achila is phrased ultimately how? as lo ye'achel. As lo ye'achel. So, I'm sorry, lo ye'achel is bisaro. So I might have thought, therefore, the Isra Achila only applies to the basar and not to the hide. Therefore, again, Kamash Malon, no Kashan and Bala Sharnaki comes to teaching that what? That the hide is Asr B'Naro. So I just want to point out, according to what the Gemara just said, this works very beautifully according to Rabbi Avo. Meaning, Halacha L'Maisa, Lo Ye'achel does in fact come along to teach us that what? That Halacha L'Maisa, there is an Isra Achila and an Isra Hana by Shor HaNiskal. I said, why do I need Ubala Shor Naki? To teach me ultimately again that the hide is Asr Ba'anah as well. Ulahanach Tanoi de Mafkile Lahaikra, the Drash Achrini. So I'll say, but according to the opinions who say that Ubala Shor Naki comes to teach me something else, namely, Lechatzi Kofer. I will say, interestingly enough, Kofer is the payment that a person pays if their ox kills someone, if it's a muad. But halacha l'maisa again, if an ox is a first-time offender, halacha l'maisa again, there's no such thing as chatzi kofer as opposed to chatzi nezek. Or again, dmei velados. If an ox scores a pregnant woman and as a result she miscarries, there is no financial penalty for that. As opposed to, let's say, if a person injures a pregnant woman and she miscarries, there is a penalty for that. So according to the opinions who hold that Bala Sharnaki teaches me that there's no concept of Chatzi Kofer, or there's no concept of damages for causing a miscarriage. So the Gemara says, Hanas Oro Minalu. Where do they learn out? Where do they learn out that you're not permitted to get hana, to get benefit from the hide of the Shor HaNiskal? Nafkaluhu me es bisaro. They learn out, Rabbi say, from the phrase es bisaro. Rabbi say, remember again, es hatafa lo bisaro. So remember again, the Torah said, v'lo yachel es bisaro. Could have just said lo yachel bisaro. What does it mean, lo yachel es bisaro? Rabbi say, es is a ribui. Es comes to include something else. So what they understand is es comes to include that which is attached to the basar. What's attached to the basar? What's attached to the basar? The hide. And therefore they don't have to hide. So we'll listen to this. V'idach, the other opinion, which is really Rabbi Avon, others will say es lo darish. They don't darshan esin. Rabbi say, get ready for this. Why don't we darshan esin? Rabbi say, an incredible and beautiful Gemara with which we will end today. So we'll say, so why don't they darshan des? Rabbi say, get ready for this. Kidisanya. Shimon ha'amsuni, Ramalei Nechemia ha'amsuni, hayadarish kol esin Shabbat Torah. So we'll say, Shimon ha'amsuni, he used to darshan every es. Because Rabbi say, remember again, es is a ribui. Whenever you see the word es is coming to include something. So for example, we just saw it by Shor HaNiskal. V'lo ye'achel es bisaro, meat. You can't eat the meat and something else which is attached to the meat. What's attached to the meat? The hide. So we'll say, so Shimon HaMsuni generally would darshan all of the esin in the Torah. Kevan she'egia le'es Hashem Elokecha tira piresh. I will say, when he got to the phrase, to the pasuk, es Hashem Elokecha tira, that you should fear HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we'll say, now watch this. If ultimately, again, es is a riboy, that es always comes to include something else, then es Hashem Elokecha tira would come to include fear something in addition to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shimon HaMsuni felt there can't be any other type of fear, or really when I say fear, by the way, I will say, the better word for fear, it's not really fear. Yira, I believe Yisrael Berditchev writes, Yira is not really fear. What is it? It's reverence. It's reverence, right? It's a feeling of reverence, or awe of something, but reverence to revere something. So when it says Es Hashem Elokecha tira, I'm supposed to revere the Ribono Shel Olam. What else could I possibly hold in the same level of reverence as the Ribono Shel Olam? So what happened? Piresh. So we'll say Shimon HaMsuni said, I'm hanging up my es gloves, right? I'm not darshaning any more esin. Right? Clearly, again, I hit a wall over here. I'm not darshaning es anymore. Amrul Talmid of Rebbe, Kol esim shedarashta mate alehen. So he said, Rebbe, but what about all of the esin? What about all of the drushes you made up until now? What's the status of those drushes? Amr lahem. Listen to how beautiful this is. Kishem shekibalti schar ala drusha, kach ani mekabel schar ala prisha. So he said to them, the same way that I was mekabel schar for all of the drushes I made, I'm going to be mekabel schar for stopping to make those drushes. I was saying, the same way that there's incredible schar in life for being right, there's also schar in life for admitting when you're wrong. So I will say, the greatest challenge in life is that sometimes we espouse, and this is everything in life, I espouse the hashkafa, I espouse the shita, I espouse a way of life, I espouse the derech, and then it's wrong. and then it's wrong. Right? We'll say, and then it turns out that it's inconsistent, it's not correct. So what happens? Most of us, instead of saying, okay, look, I tried, I was wrong, and now I'm going to recalibrate, I'm going to try and go in a different kiva, in a different direction. So halacha l'maisa, we just kind of dig in. We kind of dig in. That's just human nature. Because I don't want to admit that I'm wrong. I don't want to admit that I went on a wrong derech. And I don't want to admit that maybe the hashkafa, the lifestyle, the approach that I've had up until this point has been incorrect. Because what does that mean about everything I did up until now? Shimon Amsuni says, find the courage to say you're wrong. Find the courage. And by the way, when you find the courage to say you're wrong, it doesn't chas v'shalom negate everything you did up until then. Up until then, you tried your best. Now you realize again you have to try a different best going forward. The same way that there's schar ultimately again for trying your best in the past, there's also schar for trying your best in your future. So Shimon Amsuni said, I tried to darshan the yes and I thought I was doing a good job until I got to Es Hashem Elokecha Tira and I realized that my approach was incorrect. So therefore again I have to stop, I have to recalibrate, I have to go. It's such an incredible thing. This is why the Gemara Masechah Shabbos says, "Lamad l'shon chalomer ini yodea." I have to teach my tongue to say I don't know, because it's not natural to say I don't know. It's not natural to say I was wrong. It's not natural to say what worked for the past doesn't work for the future. It's not natural. We are creatures of habit, and we don't like to admit that we're wrong. And even when I'm confronted when I'm wrong, I'd sooner dig in than go ahead and pivot and go in a different direction. And Shimon Amsuni says, I was wrong. I was wrong. And the same way that I was makabel schar in all of the past drushes, I'll now be makabel schar in pivoting, going in a different direction. Actually, Rabbi Akiva, both let's just finish it. Rabbi Akiva came along. V'darash es Hashem Elokecha Tira l'rabos talmidei chachamim. So we'll say amazing enough so beautifully. Rabbi Akiva comes to Shimon Amsuni. You weren't wrong. You weren't wrong. You just didn't know the drasha. There is a drasha. Yes, your drashas with S are correct, right? S always comes to include something else. So we'll say Es Hashem Elokecha Tira. What else could be included in the reverence of the Ribono Shel Olam? Rabbi Akiva said, reverence of Talmidei Chachamim. The Rabbi say to go ahead and revere and respect and honor Talmidei Chachamim is an extension of the reverence and respect that we give the Ribono Shel Olam. So I will say it's interesting. So the Sfas Emes says, so why didn't Shimon HaAmsuni realize this? Why didn't he dash on this? So it is incredible. So the Sfas Emes says, because Shimon HaAmsuni was such an anav, he was so humble. The notion of giving a drasha that would potentially go ahead and require people to give him more honor, he cannot be masig that type of drasha. He just couldn't. So I said, how does Rabbi Akiva come up with it? Because also remember again, Rabbi Akiva was a Baal Tshuva, right? Rabbi Akiva was the one who said, before I became a Baal Tshuva, if he would have shown me a Talmud Chacham, I would have bitten him like a donkey. Right? That's what Rabbi Akiva said. Rabbi Akiva had a distaste. Because again, in general, we generally tend to dislike people who deep down we really feel point out something missing in us. So Rabbi Akiva understands the reference to Talmidei Chachamim because he came from the outside in. Shimon HaAmsuni, who was always in it, could not fathom a drasha that would seem self-serving, that would seem the Rabbos Talmidei Chachamim. So his humility prevented him from seeing the drasha. But Rabbi Akiva, who came from the outside in, was able to see that the kavod due to the Ribono Shel Olam, or I should say the kavod due to Talmidei Chachamim, is just like the kavod due to the Ribono Shel Olam. Don't say beautiful, incredible drasha. We'll stop over here for today. The topic continues in Mirz Hashem tomorrow, boss. I'm still trying to figure out Isra Achila, Lo Ye'achel, Rabbi Avo, Chizkiah. Mirz Hashem to be continued. Shkarach, bossai. Chevron Zoom, everyone have a wonderful day. Shkarach, everyone. Very sure. Oh, interesting, beautiful. But who says that? Miri. Beautiful.